Right. Good afternoon to everyone who's just joined, and thank you very much for joining this event on the Credit Commons Protocol. It's a real pleasure to see so many people here for what should be a really interesting event. My name's Tom, and I'll be chairing the Q&A, but first I'd like to give a quick introduction to this event and our two speakers. This is the second in a series of events organised by the Circular Economy Analytics Group, which was founded by Dil Green and myself as a forum for understanding how novel means of exchange systems can underpin the collaborative economy. We take a broad approach based on deriving practical tools and analysis for the users and conveners of mutual credit networks using theoretical frameworks such as network science and promise theory. We aim to continue hosting events such as this from time to time, but we also hold more frequent and informal meetings at which new members are invited to present their work. So in this session, we'll be hearing about the Credit Commons Protocol as a proposed basis through which to achieve scale in the collaborative economy, federating all kinds of groups together for exchange with ever decreasing reliance on bank money, and without these groups needing to change anything about their own models. The structure of the session will be alternating sections from our speakers Matthew Slater and Dil Green for the first hour, followed by about 15 minutes of questions and answers. Please post your questions in the chat and I'll collect them and read them out to our speakers. After the closeout, we'll also keep the Zoom room open for a free-form discussion. I'd now like to take a minute to introduce our speakers. Matthew Slater has built and maintained open source community currency software since 2008. He co-authored the Money and Society MOOC with Professor Jem Pendell and the Credit Commons white paper with Tim Jenkin. He also recently introduced a paper on the growth imperative inherent in the monetary system. Dil Green was the co-founder and admin of Brixton Letts in the 1990s, and more recently has been a co-founder of the Open Credit Network in 2020 and convener of the Mutual Credit Services Collaboration. He's a former architect and pattern language practitioner, and at present is piloting Credit Commons Protocol networks in the UK. I'll now pass over to Dil, who will set out the context for the rest of the discussion. Over to you, Dil.
Thanks, Tom. Hi, everyone, and thanks for being here. We think that there's something powerfully useful about this Credit Commons protocol, and we're very glad to have a chance to set out the thinking, and we're very grateful to have so many people here to listen. If you will, during the presentation and the questions, we'd love you to think about whether you might want to help refine and promote the practical introduction of these ideas through an embryonic Credit Commons organization. I'm going to start with a quick tour of the obvious, just to make it clear how we see the context of this work. Hopefully there will be the odd angle, which is refreshing. The emergency. In my view, all talks need to begin with a slide on the emergency. It needs to be the context for all our serious investment of time, effort, resource from now on and for generations to come. Business as usual takes us to perhaps a 4.5-degree rise in global mean temperatures, which would be an utter catastrophe for human civilization. The evolutionary unit of selection whose fitness is being challenged by this crisis is civilization. Not the species, not the tribe, certainly not the planet, or any particular aspect of our societies, but our civilization itself. A civilization which, like it or not, is largely conditioned by exchange relationships. We need to transcend the current economy, and within a few decades, to become a collaborative economy. One that is regenerative. It's no longer enough to reduce harms. We're required to look for approaches which can rebuild, both on a social level and in terms of the biosphere. Non-coercive. Wage labor is coercion. Capitalism forces all to sell themselves. Producer credit and producer theories of value are about empowering value creators and empowering diversity. For this to work, the new economy must regenerate the commons too, so that care, learning, reputation and governance are neither dependent on or conditioned by hoarded abstract money units, but upon the productivity of the commons. And last but not least, local first. Self-sufficiency is incompatible with the full flowering of human diversity. We need to interact right across the globe. But healthy feedback loops should encourage all sorts of contexts to discover their appropriate locality. Not only localities of place, but of interest, of specialism, and of practice. And all of these in dynamic interrelationship. Describing viable economic models that are less destructive, that are less systemically cruel, is not easy, but it's also not the hardest part of the work. What we need is careful analytical theories of change that help us to meet billions of people where they are and offer them new choices, which are at the same time immediately beneficial to adopt and which carry implicit feedback loops which drive the change we wish to see. Such theories of change must be derived from systems understandings. The global economy is a complex adaptive system, in the top 5 of which we are aware, in terms both of scale and of dynamism. Failure to understand and incorporate this reality into our work will result in failure. Let's imagine the economy as a grassland ecosystem for some top-level analysis. What we'll see is that most progressive proposals are in fact in-band reactions to perceived injustices and dangerous outcomes. Such proposals, however well meant, will not achieve what they set out to do, as the system will either reject, ignore, or recuperate them. Imagine introducing a new plant species into the grassland. The system will apparently change, but the underlying mechanisms and outcomes remain essentially the same. A perfect example of an in-band change was the introduction of the welfare state, a massive redistribution of the cake in favor of labor. At the same time, it made consumerism possible, intensifying many destructive outcomes and strengthening the grip of capitalism on the world economy. Such proposals, however radical in intent, operate in fact as R&D for the system. Still other proposals are top-down. They look to policy prescriptions. These are like trying to change the weather. But the biosphere, the real biosphere, has long ago learned to manage the weather, to the extent of being able to bring about ice ages when it needs them, if you look at Gaia theory. In the same way, the economy has learned to manage policy, to the extent of changing governments when it needs to. Here, the ineffectiveness of the IPCC is our example. Changes in the underlying biochemistry, however, are irresistible to the system and effectively invisible, even if carried out in plain sight. Our example here is Nixon's 1971 abrogation of the gold standard for the dollar. Through a single executive order, no Congress, no debate, enormous long-term changes were set in motion. But in the short term, everything just carried on as normal. There was almost no kickback. The creation and character of money is the invisible biochemistry of the economy. So the good news is that since 2008, there's been an unprecedented level of interest in and creativity around means of exchange mechanics. This is long overdue. The bad news is none of this has made a blind bit of difference. It hasn't even slowed the growth of destructive impact on human social relations and the biosphere of the economy. I hope I've set the stage for Matt to introduce the development of the Credit Commons protocol.
Thanks, Dave, and everyone. Dil already mentioned the need for urgency. A new money system is as urgent as everything else, but reaching the required scale presents a number of hard problems. The advantage of small projects is that they are agile, easier to fund, and much harder to co-opt. And there is room for many more of them. So we have many more leaders and many more experiments. And yet it's very rare that I hear about projects that actually change the system in the way that, say, the labor movement did or the co-op movement did. A lot of activism these days seems to focus on the charismatic individuals who start businesses or projects that have good narratives or a good impressive impact, at least for their size, but then make no mark on the monster, which is almost literally eating their children. And I've been watching complementary currencies for over a decade, as a great many projects have burst on the scene with some ill-conceived notions, blown someone's money on public relations and shoddy software, and then disappeared into a void of what I presume to be shame. Perhaps you've seen projects like that, and this is not the way to make progress in this field. It seems to me that too many brilliant and energetic people are trying to save the world single-handedly, perhaps because of some deep narratives within them or within our society about individualism and heroism. So I can't speak for fields like food production or medicine or politics or media activism, but in this field, my field, I'm sure that we cannot address the monetary dimension to the omni crisis by simply letting 1,000 flowers bloom. I guarantee that 990 of them will die before they bloom, and the other 10 will have no systemic impact. The monetary dimension requires large intervention. There are serious difficulties, though, with building or trying to build big institutions. I have some idea about the costs and risks of building a mass consumption software platform, but which does not compare with the cost and the risk of trying to get people to use it. And I'm at a loss for what to say to the venture capitalists who like throwing money at such projects. They've never thrown money at my projects. Even if such a platform could be built, how would we retain control of it? Large organizations are by nature vulnerable to all kinds of compromises, from being called to partner with the government, like Google and Facebook, to becoming respectabilized, like Greenpeace, or to being outright sabotaged by the security service moles, like the National Union of Mine Workers in the UK. Or they could become the very thing they opposed, like the Co-op Bank in the UK. So the paradox of scale, that is the title of this slide, is that we must be both small and large. And what does that mean for a monetary system? Does it mean that we can't build currencies with more users than the Dunbar number? No. Does it mean that we can't approach venture capitalists? No. Does it mean that we all have to fall into line behind a great leader? No. It means that we have to coordinate and support one another, and probably compromise with one another much more than we have been. The Credit Commons offers a way forward. But first, Dil has allowed me to address you on my favorite subject, monetary theory. Throughout history, there are basically two different ways of thinking about money, and they result in very different economic policies and institutions and technologies. The two ways are intellectually very distinct, as I will explain, but in practice, they're all mixed up, confused even, to the extent that our actual money creation takes place in one paradigm, while all the discourse about money is in the other. The grotesqueness could not be better illustrated than with this Visa gold check credit card, but maybe it suits Visa to suggest that their promises are somehow like gold. Meanwhile, most of the alternative currency innovation going on this decade is in one paradigm, while the Credit Commons is in another. So I want to briefly cover those two paradigms, especially for the benefit of any cryptocurrency fans who might be present. The popular discourse about money states that money is essentially a commodity like gold, and that means the acts of buying and selling are simply a swap of value for value. This holds even when the object used as money has no intrinsic value. There is a narrative that the banknote or bill is valuable because it is backed by something, although what exactly that thing is and what exactly it means to be backed is never clear. In the old days, the bank or the goldsmith would hold gold in the vault equal to the value of the note and would guarantee it to redeem the note for gold. In this way, the paper is a commodity, not because of the gold, but because of the narrative around it. The other discourse about money is that it is basically not valuable, but merely a promise of value. Even gold is mostly not valued for its own intrinsic usefulness, but for what it promises to buy on the marketplace. In this case, money is not really something physical, but something social. It depends for its existence on a network of relationships and agreements. Each kind of money, or if we can be more nuanced, each view of money has strengths and weaknesses and may be appropriate to different situations. For example, credit money is cheap and easy to move because you don't need armed guards and security vans. You just need a wire to send the information down. On the other hand, if the market should fail, your credit money is worthless, while your gold, if you can't consume it, will be worth something in the next market. Credit money can be created ex nihilo and at no cost. It's as easy as writing a check. But for each unit of commodity money, something must be produced and then locked in a vault, which makes commodity money rather expensive. The reason I want to address cryptocurrency fans is that right off the bat, Bitcoin espoused the commodity view of money, even without the suggestion of a commodity behind it. The reason is that the whole paradigm of trustlessness completely excludes the possibility of credit. Most cryptocurrency discourse is about criticizing fiat money without remotely understanding how fiat money works, or even the notion that credit is a viable form of money. When you imagine money as an object, you can imagine a machine that mints the object and moves it between different people's safe boxes. And you could design a machine to do that. But when you understand money as essentially a set of relationships and contracts, which just use tokens to help keep count, machines cannot play such a central role. Property ownership and the risks and rewards that go with it might be absolute in the jungle, but in society, they must always be negotiable. There's much more to say about these views of money and how they confuse not only the public, but the politicians and economists. But in the meantime, I recommend following Brett Scott, who constantly finds inventive new ways of describing it. I need to say a bit more about what it is that makes each type of money valuable, because the differences between the two paradigms are really profound. A commodity money is as valuable as the commodity behind it, which means its value fluctuates constantly, absent some wealthy entity who is committed to stabilizing the price in the market, or some law which tries to fix the price. Conversely, the value of credit money is much more stable, precisely because it does not need to be anchored to a commodity for which the supply and demand are always in flux. Credit money usually references an abstract unit of value. A commodity money is as valuable as the commodity behind it, which means its value fluctuates constantly, absent some wealthy entity who is committed to stabilizing the price in the market, or some law which tries to fix the price. Conversely, the value of credit money is much more stable, precisely because it does not need to be anchored to a commodity for which the supply and demand are always in flux. Credit money usually references an abstract unit of value. A voucher for a kilo of potatoes might have a nominal value of €1, but at the end of the day, its actual value is a kilo of potatoes. It can never buy more than a kilo of potatoes, although it could buy nothing if, say, the producer dies or the potato blight strikes. Let's make this a bit more concrete with a thought experiment. Imagine a vegetable market in which everything is priced in potatoes. Carrots are 1/6 of a potato, turnips are 1/2 of a potato. There are two ways that you could exchange carrots for turnips. You could go and get potatoes and change the carrots for potatoes and then change the potatoes for turnips. That's how commodity money works. It means that if the second part of the exchange doesn't happen, or until it happens, you haven't really lost anything. And you can always take the potatoes somewhere else and buy what you want or eat them. However, it does mean that a lot of potatoes are simply circulating as a medium of exchange and they're not being eaten. Some people think that this is a waste of potatoes And some people think it's worth it if the potatoes are performing this essential function of the marketplace. But the issues run a bit deeper than that. It's never really clear if the potatoes are the medium of exchange or if they are the object of exchange, especially if people think that the price of potatoes might increase. The whole market then gyrates around the variable price of potatoes. Speculators might buy up all the potatoes, and then trade would have to stop until people were so desperate for a medium of exchange that they would borrow the potatoes at interest. In fact, this is what always happens. But if you stop and think for just one moment, it's obvious that you don't actually need potatoes to exchange. You can simply reference the potato as a measure of value. You can simply swap turnips directly for carrots at a ratio of 1:3. Now, credit money avoids this ambiguity of commodity and credit money because it's clear that nobody actually wants to own credit as an end in itself. When you buy something on credit, it's much clearer to all parties concerned that the exchange is only half complete. The credit is represented as numbers in an account or on a piece of paper with a signature, which explains what real thing it can be redeemed for. And the circle of exchange completes when the token or note returns to the hand of the issuer, and in whose possession it becomes as worthless as a blood transfusion from the left arm to the right. If there is ever a shortage of credit money, creating it is as simple as writing a check. The infamous wizard of money, John Law, expressed it so elegantly when he wrote that money is not the value for which goods are exchanged, but the value by which they are exchanged. Most exchanges, though, aren't simultaneous, and they aren't straight swaps of equal value for equal value. They probably involve many parties in a continuous process of giving and receiving. So if each party isn't holding potatoes and swapping them, how do traders know the difference between producers looking to complete an exchange and beggars looking to get goods for nothing? Credit money is the means by which the marketplace remembers who has supplied how much to the markets, and therefore how much those people can take out of the market. Credit money is simply a record, perhaps a public record that everyone can trust. If you have a governed and law-abiding marketplace, credit is vastly preferable to commodity money. It's much more convenient, stable, and manipulable than potatoes. The difficulty with credit money is that it is never worth quite as much as the face value, because there is always that little risk that the issuer will default. And this is more problematic when, as is almost always the case, there are actually many issuers of credit, and each issuer has its own different default risk. And that makes credit inconvenient or risky for use in trade. Credit money systems then face a problem that credit from different issuers is not fungible. That means that different issuers' credits are not interchangeable because each credit carries a different risk. In other words, you don't accept IOUs from people you don't know. What's needed then is some kind of standard of value to make things exchangeable. We've faced this problem before, though. If you think about it, the marketplace and the money itself is an institution for making diverse goods fungible, exchangeable with one another. But now we face a situation when the money itself is not fungible between different countries or different markets. The solution is to make another market for the monies themselves, so that traders know they can exchange the money they have for the money they want at a predictable price. And these markets work in just the same way as the markets I described on the previous slide. There is a standard of value, say the dollar, and there is an agreed medium of exchange, say the dollar. In our world, the dollar is enthroned as the money of monies, and all prices revolve around the availability of the dollar, and the ones who can issue dollars are able to suck money out of foreign markets by lending those scarce dollars at interest. The trustless ethic means that all exchanges between altcoins happen via the king of crypto, Bitcoin. To a lesser extent, there are also Ethereum markets, and this further increases the demand for Bitcoin. And so we see that Bitcoin is the money of crypto, just as dollars are the money of all the other currencies. The rest of the complementary currency movement has never had the resources or the political will to build an exchange. And if they did, would they ever agree on what to use as a medium? But as I have explained, in a trustful, governed environment, an environment most of us would prefer to live in, no medium of exchange is required. That's where the credit commons comes in. A huge problem in the alternative currency movement, in my opinion, has been that mutual credit systems don't scale. Because they depend on a kind of visceral trust or familiarity between the members, and because there are no men with guns or blockchains to substitute for that trust, as groups grow, we find that the average trust between members is inversely proportional to the size. And therefore, those institutions tend to become more and more centrally controlled. So right from when I started working with Let's in 2008, I was interested in the question of how to connect these small groups together into a global payments network. In order to pay Dil, for example, my account must be decremented and his account incremented. But that's impossible if our accounts are on different ledgers whose balances must add up to zero. The solution is to create a ledger of ledgers and an account in each child ledger that corresponds to its balance of payments. And then I can pay into the balance of payments account for my group. Dil's group's balance of payments account can pay him, and the parent ledger records that a payment went from my group to his group, and all the ledgers keep a zero balance. There had been a few experiments creating what was basically a Let's of Let's, but it always involved several humans intervening on every transaction because the software had no notion of trading off ledger or talking to other ledgers. And there was a nagging question: what happens when you want to trade from one network to another network? Do you have to build another tier? It took me several years to realize that if every tier used the same mechanism, I could design a protocol that worked recursively. A payment could be routed via parent groups of parent groups until it reached a group that contained both accounts and then be routed through the respective child groups to the recipient. So the Credit Commons protocol defines how child ledgers and parent ledgers pass payments between them. We use the metaphor of a tree, and we talk about leaves, twigs, branches, and the trunk. You can trace a payment from any leaf to any other leaf by moving towards the trunk until you're on a common branch, and then moving back out. And this recursion means that any number of entities committed to maintaining a balance of trade can now exist in a single payments network, without any one group having to grow too large. Furthermore, the twigs on the tree didn't have to be Let's systems. It didn't matter at all how they worked internally. If money is for use with people outside of our circles of reciprocation, the Credit Commons invites all 8 billion of us into that circle and suggests that money could be entirely replaced by credit that we issue ourselves. Enough dreaming. As a strategy for the omni-emergency, the Credit Commons is interesting for many reasons. It enables us to build a network from the bottom up, gradually joining together into larger and more coherent structure. All credit comes from the leaves. Each group remains completely sovereign, maintaining its own ledger, its own credit allocation policy, and its own membership rules. There is no centralized control or platform. There is only the need for governance of the protocol itself. And all participation is voluntary, which means if you don't like how your group is run, or you think it's been co-opted, you can just start a new group or even a new tree. Most innovations that I've seen in the complementary currency space involve the issuance of a currency and then trying to get people to use it. To make it usable often involves either printing notes or providing some kind of payments app. Then you have to target your community with propaganda and convince them that it will make their lives better. This approach reminds me very much of the tech investment scene, where you think of a new technology, you design a business model, you find an angel investor, you build a platform, and then you try to attract customers. The angel investors know very well how hard this is and what proportion of their projects are likely to fail. But complementary currency innovators just keep on doing the same thing and making the same mistakes. The modern internet is a huge archipelago of these platforms. Each platform is like a private island, like private property of somebody who makes the law, builds the tools, and controls the data and the code. This is true from facebook.com to my own website, matslats.net. But all these private spaces are linked using a lower level technology which was built by academics and scientists who wanted to share and communicate, rather than by capitalists who wanted to extract rent. Compare a communication system like Skype or Zoom with the much older email. With Skype and Zoom, all of your communication happens across their servers, and they know you by your email address. They can block you if they want. You can't build your own Skype software or communicate directly from your Skype program to anyone else's Skype program. But with email, you can. And that's because Skype is a platform while email is a protocol. Platforms are inherently private property, and protocols are inherently public, like language. Almost all the complementary currency efforts have been about building platforms which require users to do things in a particular way, or use a particular currency, or comply with a particular ideology, which constrain them to a particular user interface and business model. The activist platform owner ends up trying to build a network from nothing, while at the same time being responsible for software development and communication and governance. And this is just not sustainable. Even funded projects rarely achieve this. The Credit Commons, however, is not a platform, it's a protocol. That means anyone can just pick it up and use it to communicate transactions with anybody else. It doesn't care what the currency is, who is in charge, whether they are capitalists or hippies. Like the English language, it doesn't care if you're a bot or a person, real or fake, rich or poor. Credit Commons protocol is just a definition. It's a standard, and you can use it or not use it. So here's what the Credit Commons protocol does in a nutshell. It defines a payment message between two ledgers which have a parent-child relationship. That means it's got a handful of data fields, as Dil will explain. The payment object includes a couple of fields for workflow, so that a payment might be flagged as pending, confirmed, or deleted, and it can move between those transaction states. When a ledger receives a payment, it can either reject it as invalid or accept it. In order to validate the transaction, the ledger might pass it on to another ledger, a child, or a parent. And then any ledger can add a supplementary transaction to the main one if it wants to, say, add fees. Finally, it's possible to interrogate the ledger to find out what transactions are stored there and what the account balances are. The ledgers ensure that they agree on the transaction record by each calculating a hash from the history of transactions they share. Any software application that can communicate in this way can share transactions or share a transaction history with any other application. The protocol strongly implies what the software should be about. Each software application should probably be a ledger with its own user accounts and transactions going between the accounts. It might have account limits to prevent users from getting too far in debt or in credit. It may or may not want to share its transaction record with the outside world. Doesn't matter. So you see, we're not defining a currency at all. We are providing a way for independent projects to quickly build their own currency market and connect it to others. The Credit Commons protocol aims to make fungible all the 1,000 flowers which have yet to bloom. Protocol, of course, is like a cake recipe, mouth-watering to read perhaps, but in the end, someone has to make a real cake. Dil is now going to talk about the practical application of the protocol in exchange between real-world groups.
Right, the purpose of the protocol is to provide a context for the collaborative economy to flourish without setting itself up in opposition or even as an alternative to the current system. As far as possible, it aims to seamlessly integrate with everything people understand about money already, with immediate early adopter benefits, or optimization of which strengthens the feedback loops, which then supports more collaboration, more inclusion, more scaling out, which then drives increasing network effects, which supports increasing autonomy and financial empowerment through reduced need for bank money. It introduces, as Matthew said, a simple standard. As the HTTP packet, the shipping container and other abstraction layers have powered new communication capacities in their contexts, so can an abstraction layer allow communication between trading groups. Of course, the dollar and the Forex markets already exist, but depending upon these will ensure that any novelty, any attempt to escape from the bank gets quickly folded back into the existing system. The Credit Commons protocol defines the packet in basic terms while allowing essentially infinite layering through business logic and message components. In order to enable exchange without introducing a new commodity as a currency, a context that is mutually acceptable to all participants must be established. Within this context, parties are free to develop their own sovereign agreement. The protocol and the shared ledger it uses maintain a balance of trade figure for each member in respect of the group as a whole, pretty much nothing else. The history of the transactions which lead to that balance. Beyond this, members are free to make any arrangements that work for them. Of course, most groups will be concerned to manage risk, particularly around default, and will want tried and tested frameworks and to be able to access communities of practice. So reference frameworks will be required. And at the same time, over time, particular versions for specific contexts will evolve. If you're seeing any parallel between the history of the Linux software and distributions, we're very happy about that. How does a mutual ledger allow for settlement of trade obligations without bank money? A variety of liquidity saving mechanisms are used, which will clear some proportion of the transactions internal to the group. The proportion of these transactions that are cleared depends on various conditions, diversity, scale, amount of intertrade, and the like. These mechanisms have really long histories and are already in use across the financial sector in large institutions in a wide variety of forms. There is nothing radical or new about them. What the protocol and the frameworks around the protocol do is to make these mechanisms accessible to and effective for grassroots value creators and traders by virtue of the federative model. In brief, these mechanisms are continuous clearing, simply netting off of trades which can be resolved because they occur in cycles. Let's say A owes B, owes C, owes D, owes E, who owes A. No money needs to change hands to settle all of those debts. Account limits. These make clear the amount of risk which is to be shared within the context and its apportionment between the members. Periodic settlement, another well-known tool. The longer the period before members have to pay any outstanding balance in hard currency will produce greater impact from clearing, reduce their reliance on that hard currency. And then finally, mutual credit. In a business-to-business context, you could just as well describe this as pooled trade credit. Essentially, how much of an imbalance each member is allowed to carry over from one settlement period to the next. Work by Thomas Fleischmann and others presented in the previous presentation in this group, and there's a video of that on the YouTube channel, has shown that in conditions of perfectly ordinary diversity and scale among totally straight businesses, this liquidity saving can amount to 50% of all trade on average, for a 50% reduction in the need for bank money in a trading context. Where economies are more strongly directed towards intertrade and where trust is good, Thomas has shown that it is easily possible to achieve 100% independence from the banking system. These mechanisms have all been seamlessly embedded into the simple trade credit clubs proposition developed by the Mutual Credit Services Collaboration, which is ready for adoption by trading groups of all kinds. The protocol can be used for any context where mutual accounts are useful. Members of such contexts arrange their own private affairs in any way they wish, subject to mutually agreed conditions of membership. So one single network could unite a blockchain, a community operating on a gift economy basis, a straight business, a housing co-op, even a sports club. How each of these operates their own internal finances would be no business of the trading group. All that matters is their mutual acceptability to each other as trading partners and the proportion of their trade that is internal to the group, without which there would be no economic reason for association. Which is not to say you couldn't make a group on the basis of some other reason for association and look to a wider group to validate your creditworthiness. In the same way, when a group joins a wider group on the basis of the protocol, that group's internal arrangements are its own business. Transactions that travel across the federation are carried by messages between ledgers rather than through sharing of databases. Each ledger operates on messages it receives and chooses for itself which messages to send. Of course, a ledger that doesn't use the protocol will find it hard to communicate with other ledgers that will. In order to derive any benefit from these mechanisms, members must collaborate to some minimal extent. They must at least send their transaction data to the shared ledger. If they wish to increase this benefit, they will need to deepen their collaboration. There are many ways this could happen, but let's take federation as a key example. When a trading group joins with other trading groups into a wider shared ledger context, they have a single balance of trade account with that context. It will have a balance limit assigned, and any imbalance will need to be settled in a hard currency. To manage this well, the members will have to run this account as a joint account. Any member who wishes to spend, let's say, all the remaining credit, who fails to consult with other members before doing so, will likely experience kickback. This incentive to collaborate provides either an improving virtuous cycle of increasing collaboration, bringing increasing benefits, supporting enhanced trust, and so on, or, of course, a spiral of despair, where poor collaboration decreases the benefits and eats away at trust. In this context, collaborative trust-building groups will do better than competition-heavy, distrustful ones. Although the Credit Commons Protocol can work with member groups using any sort of economic arrangements they wish, the means of exchange used within the shared ledger is credit, not commodity money. There are no tokens, just trade balance information. This is at base what Paul Grignon calls producer credit, and there is a producer credit theory of value in the works. In a mutual context, with an agreed unit of account, this becomes mutual credit. Matt's going to say some more about this approach.
Credit Commons joins together any monetary entities on the basis of mutual credit. So I'm going to talk a bit more about what we mean by mutual credit. In the credit view of money, someone must be trusted to issue the money. The government is a popular candidate because it has both tax income and the legitimate use of force to collect debts. In other configurations, banks are issuers, and in still others, the producers of the most commonly used goods, or utility companies, which means that even if the money stops circulating, anyone can redeem it for something they need. What matters in any configuration is who is responsible for issuing credit, who bears the risk if the issuer defaults, and who gets the rewards or the profit from what is actually a financing operation. Mutual credit is a common enough financial configuration in which many accounts on a single ledger record transactions between themselves. There are no assets or money on the ledger, and nothing goes on or off the ledger. All the transactions are records of payments, or debts if you prefer, between accounts. And that means a mutual credit ledger has the characteristic that the balances of all the accounts add up to zero. Typically, any account might be positive or negative at any time. Of course, anybody can set up a ledger with any rules and use it for various purposes, so I can only describe here a sort of archetype. This configuration happens from ordinary finance for several functions, not only or specifically to create a medium of exchange. Primarily, it's the architecture of clearing systems, where many payments between various actors are cancelled out before being settled. However, mutual credit is also the architecture of payments between account holders in any one institution or bank. So a mutual credit ledger will look very much like the bank's internal ledger. And it also resembles the structure of a savings pool in which members pool money and lend it to each other in turn. Finally, mutual credit is how lets and time banks and business barter systems do their accounts. When mutual credit is used for accounting for exchange, typically there's no interest because no assets are being lent, although there might be a risk premium. So the risk of default, if not managed otherwise, is borne by accounts with positive balances if and when the system winds up and they find that they can't spend their units. The rewards are available to all in the form of an increased diversity and availability of goods on the marketplace. If you will recall, credit money is worth what it can buy. The rewards are an increased diversity of what it can buy. This framing doesn't, of course, mean that the local busker should have the same credit as the candlestick maker or the baker, because that's a question for each community to decide. And finally, the responsibility for governance and management should fall naturally on account holders equally, since the risks and rewards are theirs. This talk needs to keep things fairly basic, so I just want to flag a few topics which I think are underexplored by economists and alternative economists alike. Firstly, it's really important to understand that using the same financial instrument as a medium of exchange and a store of value creates a profound conflict of interests. Ultimately, I would say a class war. Credit money, and especially mutual credit, makes a much better medium of exchange than commodity money, partly because credit is imaginary, so it's much cheaper to handle than real commodities, and partly because you can create it at the point of exchange as easily as writing a check. Then the role of interest is very much changed once you realize that money isn't a scarce commodity for which the haves must be compensated for lending. If interest compensates for the opportunity cost to savers who lend money that they could use otherwise, perhaps we should be talking instead about the opportunity cost to the community when assets sit idle. Mutual credit encourages us to look at the economy in this way, less as lonely individuals in a crowded marketplace trying to satisfy their needs at each other's expense, and more as groups of people whose destiny is intertwined because they all owe each other. Finally, mutual credit is about managing trade balances. This is radically opposite to the neoliberal global system that prevails today, which is all about the free flow of capital from the majority world to Wall Street. If money is that thing which settles the net debt which arises between more and less productive countries, then the promise of mutual credit is that insofar as you can balance production and consumption, you cannot be enslaved by money issuers. Balancing production and consumption, though, requires politics. Contrary to the prevailing wisdom, it doesn't happen auto-magically through floating exchange rates. Producers and consumers need to cooperate constantly to allocate resources, plan production, and minimize waste. And that's a good thing. We'd like to talk about some of the wider implications of the adoption of the protocol now. Hopefully some of these will be explored in the Q&A very soon. Over to Dil.
Thanks, Matthew. Exchange systems all result in trade imbalances. These are real and important. Mutual credit systems, when they suffer from persistent imbalances, can become moribund, and we are very clear that such systems should incorporate means to resolve persistent imbalances with harder currency exchanges in the short term. But those trade imbalances need to be taken very seriously as strong signals about what sort of capacity needs to be developed and where. So we can use such imbalances as a mechanism for investment in commons infrastructure through what Chris Cook, who's here today, has called use credit obligations. This is a whole subject in and of itself, and no doubt will be the subject of a future talk. But in short, these are net positive vouchers accepted as payment for objective goods. The more objective, the better. Kilowatt hours, square meters of land usage, basic foodstuffs, water. They can be issued as investment tokens and used also as a store of value. Traders with persistent positive balances should take that as a signal that the rest of the network needs increased productive capacity and needs to be invested in to raise their productive capacity. So you can change the persistent positive balance, exchange those for prepaid vouchers to fund commons infrastructure developments, which will redeem the vouchers once built out. Ledgers of such vouchers can be connected using the Credit Commons protocol. They could equally well be implemented through a blockchain. And that brings us to crypto. We've got no problem with crypto, except that we would like crypto people to spend as much time thinking about credit theories of money as we spend understanding commodity theories of money. The Credit Commons is not a blockchain protocol, it's a transaction data interoperability protocol. Many of the concerns which inspired blockchain are not really relevant in Credit Commons contexts. Credit money is not framed as a commodity, nor as a state-controlled fiat, nor as a store of value. The context in which these ledgers exist are boundaried, trust-based, and they operate at human scale. Trustless, permissionless attack modes, which blockchain needs to be paranoid about, are sort of not worth the bother in these contexts. The Credit Commons is a powerfully decentralizing protocol. The ledgers it uses may or may not be locally centralized or fully distributed via a distributed hash table or through a fully distributed messaging system like Secure Scuttlebutt. All these things are possible implementations of the protocol. We do wish that crypto types, as I've said, could get away from commodity framings of money, because it seems to us that these bring with them, unexamined, a great many of the drivers of economic dysfunction which plague our civilization. Matt's got some other implications to talk about.
I want to focus on one of the major benefits of a Credit Commons-based approach. With climate change underway and growing concern that it will cause super shocks to our economy and that civilization as we know it will not survive, we may be concerned. The global financial system is optimized for Wall Street to extract value from the least developed countries much more than to facilitate exchange or to withstand shocks. Shocks that can be both endogenous, like financial crashes and depressions, and exogenous, like a lockdown or a blocked canal. Either way, the system will fail when we need it most, and there will be no backup if we don't create it. So while globalism has advantages, more for some than others, it is imperative to rebalance the system and create some slack and grow supply chains which depend less on things like high energy inputs, on colonial dominance, and on the solvency of our corporations. And that means producing more things, more essential things, closer to home, while building resilience partnerships with our neighbors who live in diverse climates and bioregions. And just as a global economy uses global money, a relocalized economy will need local money. That means money which is issued to finance local production with local people bearing the risk and reward. The benefits of using local money should be much more than the import substitution, which is usually talked about. The transaction costs of using this money for a start are extremely low if all accounts exist on the same ledger. And that helps to tilt the playing field towards the local economy. Then the credit costs, if it is a mutual credit arrangement, are also free. And the solidarity that comes from mutual credit issuance also helps to support local businesses in unpredictable, complex ways. Problems that emerge with business trade balances indicate where supply and demand could nourish new local enterprises. And once the network reaches any kind of scale, it is able to start making financing decisions that now are only made by banks, meaning what does our community need and how shall we pay for it? I want to stress here that while self-sufficiency is a sensible goal, it is not an absolute. Each person and community must find their own balance of independence and interdependence, of doing things inefficiently in small quantities and enjoying the benefits of scale. The Credit Commons protocol is not prescriptive about that. It allows local governments, local credit allocation, and even local data storage. The Credit Commons has given me insights into many other topics, and maybe it could do the same for you. Here are just a few examples. The relocalization effect I just described would apply not only to the level of the leaves, but right through the tree. It's cheaper to meet needs within one's own local group, but if not, then from within the regional group or the national group. Each group at each level has its own credit policy and a political role as the forum for managing trade balances between the members. This structure embodies the extremely sensible principle of subsidiarity, that governance should be done as locally as possible. And instead of skewing prices so that, as now, the cheapest products are made the furthest away, the resulting structure would make the most distant payments the most expensive. I hear a great deal about the decentralized virtues of the blockchain, But to me, this is an extremely limited notion of decentralization, which stretches only to the question of data storage. From a monetary perspective, these blockchains are not decentralized at all. Bitcoin is a single currency with a single monetary policy and a single governance structure, and even a single ledger, albeit a distributed one. By contrast, the Credit Commons allows groups to be completely independent and self-determining, only providing the protocol for them to communicate about value exchange. I'm sure all of you here will be familiar with the problem of economic growth. I authored a paper this year that helps explain why the money system as it is necessitates economic growth and with it climate change, not to mention robbing our descendants of their health and wealth. The monetary driver of growth is when the medium of exchange is borrowed into existence and then locked away in an offshore account, so that borrowers cannot earn it back, but instead must extend their loans. And then to pay those loans back, they must produce and consume even more. In a mutual credit world where every ledger is balanced, it is much more obvious that debts cannot be paid with hoarded money. And in any case, mutual credit is not a good asset to hoard. Consequently, there are no debt slaves forced to grow the economy. Rather, the transaction volume, which is what GDP is, would reflect the amount of production and consumption that people want. The political answer to the tragedy of perpetual growth is basically recycling on steroids, which is currently called cradle-to-cradle manufacturing. We understand that the money system is designed to migrate value from the working class, which creates it, to the hedge fund managers who lock it away in perpetuity, which is to say that the money system facilitates the movement of money in a straight line. And in the opposite direction, goods and services go in a more or less straight line from the virgin fields, forests, and mountains into the trash. Consequently, it might be worth exploring how a less linear manufacturing economy, as advertised, could be supported by a less linear money system. It took me a while to realize it, but all the language I found myself using around the Credit Commons, words like egalitarian, democratic, participative, self-organized, sovereign, bottom-up, even commons, are the kinds of words used by anarchists. I don't mean the ones firebombing the police, of course, but the grown-up ones, many of whom are still in the closet. Most anarchists, though, seem to reject the idea of money, but having talked to several, I think they haven't really imagined that another money could manifest more healthy values and behaviors, especially as they try to scale their movement up. I'm going to conclude with some reflections that go even wider than the economy. Psychological experiments repeatedly show the effect that money has on us. It makes us feel insecure, selfish, and reduces our ability to perform work-like tasks. It's harder to prove, but there's plenty of conjecture about what money does to a whole society. On that note, I enjoyed especially Helena Norberg Hodges' documentary about the commercialization of Ladakh. How different would society be with a different money system? I guess a lot. Unfortunately, this question is unanswerable because the money system is not definable independently of politics, law, and society. In a normal exchange using money, the bank and the government, and sometimes many other entities, are interposed between the buyer and the seller, and they affect the transaction deeply. First, the currency itself locates the transaction in a particular marketplace and affects the prices. Then, most transactions are now surveilled in what can be used as evidence against you. These entities add friction in the form of taxes and transaction charges. They put obligations on parties such as a 30-day money-back guarantee or quality control. and they have the ability to block or reverse transactions if they want. And so all of this technical and political infrastructure casts a shadow over the transaction and over the traders. And that shadow assumes that the transactions are basically impersonal and that the traders need protection from each other. And before you know it, the people are behaving as the system defined them. And at the heart of that money and financial system we use every day is a system of markets which are widely said to have two emotions, fear and greed. Cryptocurrencies are a whole other phenomenon, psychologically and sociologically speaking, but with, unfortunately, much the same spirit. To me, cryptocurrencies embody a robust individualism and strong property rights, but since their main use is speculation, I've seen for myself how they invoke fear and greed within me. To paint a different picture, I have speculated in a rather utopian piece on creditcommons.net about what kind of society might be implied by a mutual credit economics. So I hope we've managed to outline what we see as the promise of the Credit Commons Protocol as a simple, flexible means whereby economic actors of all kinds can enter into fruitful relationships of exchange, free of the parasitic and, we would argue, omnicidal banking system. And I hope to have at least indicated the seriousness and breadth of the work we are undertaking. Rest assured that we have barely scratched the surface. But to make even a dent on the behemoth that is rapidly decomposing our bodies and minds and societies into filthy dollars, much more is needed. I'm going to hand over to Dil to explain what we hope for.
Thanks. If the promise of the Credit Commons is to be realized, then it needs to be an open protocol, accessible to all, implemented in 1,000 different ways. To achieve this, we need, first of all, more eyes on the core of the work. A protocol aimed at wide adoption should be stress tested, should be modeled, should have its architecture kicked and turned upside down and shaken hard, should be considered for vulnerabilities and unintended consequences before release into the wild. Furthermore, it will need reference implementations, not only of the protocol, but of governance, policy, legal, management systems, and the like. And of course, at the outset, it will need an initial distribution of a working package so that groups can start using it. I hope, again, some people are seeing parallels with the way Linux ecology developed. To achieve all this requires wise people spending time. And we hope that some of you will want to engage. We have the white paper as the foundation, on the basis of which we've developed logical functional specifications of workflows, an API architecture, a proof of concept code base that implements that architecture, proof of concept front end that allows us to set up ledgers and federate them together. We have Mutual Credit Services, which is a collaborative community that's been going for about a year in the UK, working to develop contexts for credit common systems here and globally. We have a developing relationship with B Solutions. I mentioned Thomas Fleischmann earlier, who gave the last presentation. They operate sophisticated cycle detection algorithms and analytical tools for credit clearing, which there are a number of models for how we can use those to kickstart credit commons groups. We have a growing circular trade analytics group that Tom mentioned at the start, which is the host for these talks, and send Tom a message if you want to engage there. We have an active pilot coming out of a small funded project, which we've just finished, centered on local food distribution businesses in the southwest of the UK, and we'll be building onto that network. We are getting increasing requests for information and support from around the world. So we seem to have got something going. But what we need is you. To help us build something we hope can be the seed of an open ecosystem. This is not an ideology, so you don't have to be a true believer or anything like that, but if you think that you could kick the tires of any aspect of this or help with development, all sorts of skills and experience will be relevant. But today, to start with, we've got a very simple ask, that you give us a point of contact.